We welcome you in on this Sunday afternoon to the Go 24/7 podcast. My name is Bryce Koon alongside Glen West. You might be watching or listening to this on Monday, and if you are, Glen and I are going to be getting ready to brave the elements once again. What is a hot fall camp here in Baton Rouge? But Glen, we've been through, I would say, 2 weeks of fall camp now, but really, I guess it's more like a week and a few days. We're going to talk about things that stood out, talk about maybe some position battles, some position races that could, take form here in the next week or two. But so far, let's kick it off with this. Your thoughts on fall camp, maybe some of the things that have kind of stuck out to you here kind of early on.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I'm proud of myself. I'm not completely red all over after spending 6 or 7 practices, in the heat and testing those conditions. And we're surviving out there, which is good. We thought for a little while we'd be on this little patio area that's kind of overlooking all the fields. That lasted about 20 minutes until Brian Kelly said, "Nope, get them down. Get them down on the field. Get them down on the field with us." So we've been on the field for all these practices, getting up close and personal look at a lot of these, a lot of these reps and a lot of these, team periods that they've been doing. And look, I think probably my overarching takeaway is that there has been some progress at times made by this defense. I'm not gonna come out here and say that this defense is looking like 2011 or anything like that, or 2010, whatever year that was. They had just like the most dominant defense ever. They've shown some strides. So like they are clearly a more confident group. They are more competitive. They have made at times they've made the offense work for their wins. I think probably we're recording this on a day after they probably had one of their worst days. So, I think, you have to kind of, take a grain of salt there with what we saw on Saturday as compared to what we've seen, as an overarching theme over the first, 7, 8 practices. But overall have been, I wouldn't say pleasantly surprised, but I've been very, I've been pleased with what I've seen, especially from this defensive backfield. I think coming in, we kind of had this thought like, okay, how much progress can they actually make? How much better can this group get? Returning much of the same personnel, and then obviously a couple of tweaks here and there with the Jordan Gilberts of the world, Deshaun Spears, PJ Woodland, those kind of guys that have been getting pretty significant reps. How big of an impact can they have? And honestly, I think I've been most pleased with Ashton Stamps. That's a guy that's really seemed to take that next step. I think the big thing with him, and as is the case with everybody on this defense, consistency is the key, and that's something that we had Blake Baker on Saturday for a media viewing or media press conference for about 20 minutes, and seemed like every answer that he was given, he was throwing the word consistency around to every question that was being asked, in terms of whether it's a specific player or just kind of the vibes he's getting from, this defense here early in camp. I think consistency is where LSU is going to have to show the most progress here over the next couple weeks. They had some moments, like I said, where they flashed some real positive signs, but also some days where it hasn't been as consistent, and the offense has really controlled the day. So we just saw that on Saturday. So I do think that there's some good progress being made there on defense, but just got to see the consistency element show a little bit more over the next several practices. And I think we'll get into a little bit more of this later, but the weeds should start to kind of dwindle here as we kind of move through this week and next week. But so far, very competitive, very aggressive is the word I would use for the defense so far. I think they've shown some aggression, and I think just overall from a team perspective, they've had some good practices. They've had some really good just kind of competitive, clean, and just kind of doing their job kind of practices that I think Coach Kelly really has appreciated these first several days.
Yeah, one of the big kind of drills we'll talk about. I mean, obviously they did some team drills and stuff like that where they may go one-on-one. We got to see that between the wide receivers and the corners there in the red zone, which was super competitive. A couple times coaches having to bark out and remind a lot of the defensive guys, hey, don't go to the ground. Like we want to keep these guys up. And then it was kind of funny, Glenn. They blow the whistle for the end of that period. We kind of head down to the opposite end of that field. Obviously, LSU has the multiple practice fields. And we get to see essentially two linemen against a defensive line, an edge rusher, and a linebacker. And we get to kind of watch what I would say. And look, this is my second fall camp, but under Brian Kelly, you can maybe speak to year one with Kelly. That's probably the most spirited drill that I've seen. And maybe it's because it was happening right in front of us and it wasn't on a field, across the way. But just in terms of the physicality, and I even asked, Blake Baker this specifically about Jacoby and Guillory, which no secret, he's going to have to be the guy on that interior spot of the defensive line, and they're going to have to figure out pieces around him. How vocal he was. Will Campbell had two pancake blocks, and he let that defensive lineman know, not in a showboat type of way, but this was very much a mano-y-mano. If you're an old school football fan in terms of, you like the physicality of the game, you would have loved to watch that period. Just kind of
Yeah.
your thoughts and what you saw. Have you seen that the previous 2 years? Off the top of my head, Glenn, I don't remember seeing such fierce competition. We saw a lot of the offense beating the defense in different drills last year. Maybe you can talk about year one and just did that stand out a lot to you about both sides going at it? Now, the offense won a lot, but the defense really, and I'll say what, Blake Baker said, he talked about, and Joe Sloan said as well, starting to gain some of that little bit of that swagger that we saw of some previous great LSU defenses.
Yeah, and that's something that's been missing the first couple of years, right? I mean, I think the kind of going into this year, we were hoping to see that this coaching staff would rub off on these defensive players in a different way than maybe the previous staff had. And that's not to knock the previous staff. I think that they put they did the best they could with what they had, but I think probably the thing that was missing was a little bit of communication between the players and the coaching staff from last year. And I think that at least through 7 or 8 practices here in fall camp and really in the spring too, you can tell these players are bought into this new system on defense. And what Blake Baker, what Bo Davis and Kevin Peoples and Corey Raymond and Jake Olson have brought has just been really just a lot of energy, a lot of positive kind of vibes that are coming from all of them right now. Bo Davis is probably the one guy that you don't want to have a bad rep in front of, because he'll call you out on it. But I think it's also it's something where these players are taking that kind of stuff to heart because they have seen improvement in their development. And you watch a guy like a Jacoby and Guillory, he looks like a different player than he did last year. I mean, he just has a more confidence to him. He's always been a talker. I mean, he's always been a good vocal leader. But he just has, I think his play is starting to match up to what his talking has been the last couple of years. So that was a really good drill to see, also because it kind of enlightens you a little bit more into how important it's going to be for this interior D line in particular to fill running lanes and to fill the gaps there and to make sure that they're doing their blocking, are kind of creating some lanes for the linebackers to have some success. And then on the offensive side of the ball, it shows us that they're really leaning into this running game a little bit more. And I think that we've seen a lot more outside zone. We've seen a lot more, leaning into those running backs, those Caleb Jackson, Josh Williams, and John Emery's had some really big runs throughout the first 7-8 practices. Caden Durham is certainly going to factor in as well. But from an offensive line perspective, seeing those guys, pull and open up running lanes in that kind of a drill where it's not a full O-line versus D-line kind of drill. It's more like, the right side of the O-line and the right side of the defensive line kind of going at it, and then the same thing on the left side. So it's a cool little drill and something that I think kind of points to what LSU wants to be kind of as an identity for what they, kind of hope to be a big part of what they're doing on offense and defense. That was a really fun drill to watch. I think they've had some competitive one-on-ones. 7-on-7s have been a little bit up and down, probably leaning more towards the offense in 7-on-7. But I thought probably my biggest thing from Saturday was the defensive backs, they got cooked on 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 7-on-7 drills. I mean, for an hour and 20 minutes, I thought kind of my big overarching takeaway from Saturday was going to be that this looked a lot like last year in fall camp with the DBs
Yeah.
and the receivers, but then they fought back on 11 on 11s, and I thought that was really important. We got to see 2 periods of 11 on 11 on the far field, so we didn't have a great angle at it, but we were able to see kind of the mosh pit of what was going on and kind of, those plays from a distance. And I thought the defense held up well. You had a couple of stuffed runs. You had a sack that would have been credited to the defense in that period as well. There was a Jair Brown interception on Garrett Nussmeier, but just talking with some people around that play in particular, and just kind of what was going on there, it was tough for the media to see, but apparently the defense had 12 players out on that play on the field. So it makes a little sense as to maybe why Nussmeier was thrown into, double coverage over there, and why that was an easier play for them to make. But and then overall, they, on that 11 on 11 period on Saturday, they didn't let the offense score a touchdown. They held them to a field goal. And so that was, a bend but don't break kind of motto that I think you'd like to see this defense be able to carry out into the season. Last year, they broke a lot. And I think you were hoping to see last year just just a couple of series where they would hold teams to a field goal or force a punt. Now I think you can kind of, I think the hope here is that you can do that more consistently and throughout the course of a game. And I think you're seeing it here in stretches during the first 7 or 8 practices. Consistency is still not where they want it. Then Blake Baker said that pretty significantly on Saturday, but they're making strides, and I think they're showing to be more physical, more aggressive, and I think that's a good starting point for where they ultimately want to be as a defense.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you on a lot of fronts, and really liked. And I think I saw some, fans' reaction on social media and maybe on our boards a little bit about, they just appreciated how candid Baker was about it. Didn't try to
Yeah.
talk it up and say we're going to be, this, and this. Hey, we're not there, and this is what we want to be. There was a question posed to him by one of the reporters that pretty much said, "What's the identity now? What do you hope it is?" And he said, "Well, here's what we hope it is. We haven't reached that yet. We got a lot of work to do." Which, look, week 2 of fall camp, folks, it's not going to be a finished product week 1 against USC. That's just not what this is. The teams, they evolve over the course of a season, but you want to see them. You want to see some mile markers that make them better. Now, Glenn, let's switch it over, because a guy that has given a lot of people fits, and talk just a little bit offensively here. Brian Kelly talked about this earlier in the week, but there seems to be a 3-headed monster at receiver, and it's kind of led by Kyron Lacy, who I don't want to get caught in the comparison game of what we saw last year, but Glenn, to a certain extent, I would say I see the same attention to detail and focus that Malik Neighbors put into going into 2023 that Lacy has at least put in. And we're starting to see some early returns on investment. Now, does that mean the DBs aren't that good, or does it mean Lacy might be a dude this year? I don't know, man. I've been impressed with the way he's carried himself. We got a chance to talk with Chris Hilton. I've got a piece coming out on Monday morning about that. And then CJ Daniels has looked smooth, and he has got the size to be a real weapon. Just kind of your thoughts on Lacy, the way he's attacked this fall camp so far, and then just really this receiver room as a whole, which you go down the list. Aaron Anderson's looked really good at times. Xavion Thomas is going to be a weapon, whether it's in the return game, and then some young players that are trying to make a name for themselves and maybe crack a rotation.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there with Lacy. I think this has been a really strong, really off season, really going back to the spring,
Yeah.
carrying it into the summer, and now here in fall. It's a different player than we saw a year ago. I don't think I've seen him drop a single pass in fall camp through the first 7 or 8 practices. There have been some targets that have been, a little bit off kilter that he hadn't been able to reel in, but in terms of just in the bread basket, within reach kind of catches, he's making the routine plays, and the routine plays have kind of been the bugaboo for Kyron over the first couple of years at LSU. He's always had that explosive ability as a receiver, and he's had such big moments at times for this team. But what's going to really take him to the next level is making those routine plays and catching the 6-7 yard routes and then turning it upfield for an extra 15, the yards after catch, and which I think can still be a huge part of his game that maybe he hasn't fully tapped into yet. I think him and Chris Hilton have been two of my bigger, takeaways offensively, because I've really loved what Chris Hilton's done. I just Joe Sloan went on about him for about 35 seconds during a big long spiel that he was talking about those three receivers that you mentioned, and he just said that Chris Hilton's one of the best stories of fall camp, just considering everything he's been through with the injuries of his past, and just kind of being behind some really good players the last couple of years as well. He probably could have stepped up into a bigger role in 2023. He was pretty healthy, but look, Neighbors and Thomas were that good. Like they were the ones that needed to get the ball. So I think now that you're seeing kind of the field open up a little bit more, the rapport is there with Garrett Nussmeier. I think with Lacey and with Hilton, those are two guys that Nuss has a really good confidence in, a really a strong chemistry with here in the early going. Those two have been mighty impressive, and I think what is also important to point out here is what you just mentioned here is that they're getting other guys involved as well. Like one of the big things that Brian Kelly talked about earlier this week was, we have kind of that identity of three guys that we know we can lean on, or that we think we know we can lean on, but getting guys like Aaron Anderson, like Shelton Sampson, like Kyle Parker, some reps with the first team, that's really helped open up this offense even more, because Nuss is going to go to those guys. Like if they're open and they're on the field, Nuss is going to find them and they're going to go to them and have them make plays after the catch. And I will say Aaron Anderson has looked really solid. Like I think that they've been able to get him the ball. Sometimes it's been with the second team, sometimes it's been with the first team, but he's made some really nice plays. And I think he's somebody that, you don't want to go beating the drum too fast for him, but if you get him in space and if you get him the ball with an opportunity to turn upfield, he's going to be a tough one to bring down or a tough one to catch. Xavion Thomas has been a little bit banged up the first couple weeks of camp. That's helped open things up for guys like Kyle Parker and Aaron Anderson, and to a lesser extent Shelton Sampson, because Sampson's more of an outside guy, where I think Xavion's going to be probably more in that slot role for LSU. But we even saw Xavion come back on Saturday and have a nice couple wins in one-on-ones, two-on-twos. So we've been saying it for a while, whether it's recruiting or just the team. I think the one position group you don't really have to worry about with LSU in terms of talent is always going to be wide receiver. They always just seem to have some guys that are there at the very least. And then, for the most part, they're going to have guys that are going to, make some big time plays and be a big part of what you do as a passing offense. And, Nussmeier's done a pretty good job, I think. He's had maybe 1 or 2 days or 1 or 2 periods where he's maybe been off or made a bad read here and there, but for the most part, he's taken what the defense is giving him. He's making the checkdowns. He's throwing the short and intermediate routes when he needs to, and then he's letting it loose downfield. And Hilton and Lacey in particular have made some really explosive plays down the field for LSU. So can't be happier with what the receivers are doing. Tight ends, Mason Taylor and Kamorian Pimpton, maybe you can touch on what you've seen from them, because I do think that those two have done a really nice job as well.
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing that's kind of, just stood out, Glenn, is that it feels like from a top-down perspective, and not even speaking anybody specifically, it's the mentality that maybe Neighbors learned from guys when he was young to what he had last year to what Lacey's doing now. It's rubbing off like this is how you do this. There's a proven method of not just in the recruiting atmosphere that this staff can point to, but like the guys in the building in terms of internal development. If you want to play in the league, and not just play in the league, but be a guy, this is how you have to do it. And there's not a workaround, this way. Like there's not an easier route to take. This is how you do it. And I think just from a top down, like even at that tight end position, like you mentioned, like Kamorian Pimpton, Trey Green, like they see the work that Mason Taylor's putting in. I talked with you about this. I think it was in Dallas. Like we're not talking a lot about this, but if Mason Taylor were to put up a monster year, what's to say he doesn't put his name in the draft? He's had some injuries. Would the risk be worth a senior year? Like that's a long time discussion we can have, later in the season. But like you're seeing a guy that we all believe can play on Sundays in Mason Taylor. Like you see in that receiver room, you watch Neighbors and Thomas do it last year. If Chris Hilton puts up Chris Hilton to me is the candidate to be like the Brian Thomas of last year, where it's like, hey, he's good, he's flashed, but if he just burst onto the scene, and then you have those young guys like, Shelton Sampson, you have Kylan Billiot, another guy that looks like a nice route runner trying to continue to learn. It's just there's a proven method that LSU has, not even just a receiver, but still with that tight end room and just almost at a lot of different positions offensively. It's like, hey, here's the blueprint. And as the staff, if you trust us, then you're going to have, and we believe you have the tools, you're going to get to the opportunity to play on Sundays and play meaningful football. And I mean, I don't know if there's a better pitch to not just recruiting, but when they sit in these fall meetings and like the amount of respect these guys have to have for the coaching staff of saying like, this is how you do it. Like, you don't have to wonder if I buy in, can I achieve what I want to achieve here? No, if you do, you will. And LSU's been really good at that. I think that's that hasn't been talked about. It's just something that more of that mentality for me. It's just been one of my big takeaways.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we kind of have harped on this offseason, just because it's a little bit different, has been just kind of the tweaks that we could see coming from this offense this year in terms of the running game and how they want to be more perimeter oriented in the run game, how they want to implement more 2 tight end sets with guys like Pimpton and Taylor and Green. But I think maybe that's our fault to a point, but like I think the core identity of this offense hasn't changed. Like, I mean, they might have some tweaks and some things here that they want to continue to improve on and evolve this offense with. But the core identity of this thing is get the ball to the playmakers, let them go make the plays. And I think you've seen that really throughout a lot of the position groups here. You talk about kind of the running backs and what we've seen from Caleb Jackson. Caleb Jackson on Saturday, there was this one play in 11 on 11s where he trucked, just absolutely ran through an LSU defensive player, and we couldn't see it. I didn't know who it was for the longest time. And then I got tipped off it was Whit Weeks. And if you know anything about Whit Weeks, he is not a small dude. He is a very physical, very hard-hitting linebacker. And just the way you could hear that hit coming from the other side of the practice facility from where the media was.
Yeah.
I mean, Caleb Jackson laid into him and it was like very reminiscent of what you could hear, later this fall, what you heard at times during the 2023 season when he had those opportunities present themselves. So like they have a lot of weapons and a lot of areas to which they can get the ball out to guys in space. Josh Williams is obviously your do-it-all back. He's done everything really, really well again in camp. And really one of the things that I think I've noticed more than anything is that LSU wants to get him the ball from a pass-catching perspective. They split him out wide, on plays. He starts in the back there with Nussmeier, and they split him out. And they get him the ball in the backfield to turn upfield for some plays. So, like, I think they know what they're doing on offense. I think they know the best way for this thing to have success is to have Nussmeier spread the ball around. That's how Nuss wants to play. He wants to throw it. He's a guy that, we've seen him have some zone reads at times, but he's not a guy that I don't think you're going to ask to turn it upfield a whole bunch with his speed. But he is somebody that I think has enough athleticism to extend plays in the backfield and continue to look downfield for throws and kind of keep the offense moving in that way. So really, I think we're right where we're right. I think the offense is right where it's supposed to be. They've looked really solid. They've got really no big deficiencies that I've seen in any position room. I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of bad. A couple of the interceptions that we've seen Nuss throw are maybe not indicative of what we're going to see this fall. Like I do think overall, while he has had a couple of bad throws, that they've been far outweighed by the really good throws that he's made. So I'm very much in the camp that this can be another top 25 kind of offense this year. And if you can get the defense out of the hundreds and up into the top 60, top 50, maybe even if you're really high on those guys and really think that you can get them improved in a pretty rapid pace, that's a team that's got the makings of being at its ceiling. And what that ceiling is, I don't know that we will have a good understanding of that until we get a couple weeks into the season, starting with that USC game. But I do think that there's a lot to be optimistic about with the way that they've started these first 7 or 8 practices. Now you just got to go out there and be more, get the consistency angle handled a little bit more on defense and continue to make strides on offense.
And it's just so interesting to talk about, like, one side of the football. There's a lot of turnover nationally. People are saying, "Oh, can they do it again?" And you and I are sitting here, Glenn, like, we see it at fall camp, and it's like, yeah, but more. We're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And now we kind of talk about the defensive. Go back to the defensive side of the football, which this is going to happen across the board, but there's probably more question marks in terms of a too deep on the defensive side than maybe on the offensive side of things. Blake Baker made the comment yesterday, and I kind of alluded to it earlier in the show, where he talked about, look, this next week, we're going to have these 6 practices. It's going to be very physical. He mentioned that Saturday was kind of the second day of like the full pads, like really starting to get into it. And look, I remember my high school coach saying, Glenn, everybody looks good in shorts and a t-shirt. But when you put the pads on, it's a little bit different. And that's when you get guys like Caleb Jackson and Whit Weeks colliding on the football field. He mentioned that this is when you're going to have separation. And I think when you look at this depth chart, look, we'll just say it. Javian Toviano, he's been taking reps. I think that's the biggest thing we saw yesterday. Defensive line wise, Gio Pius wasn't out there yesterday per multiple, outlets reporting that. And we can also say that as well. Sean Washington has looked like he could be a guy that kind of fits in. JVR Suggs is, we're going to see. Where do you feel that maybe some of the a battle that you're going to be watching? Is it as easy to say as that second defensive tackle? I know a lot of people, including myself, are intrigued with the secondary, but I do agree with Blake Baker. Like, week 3 of fall camp, you're not close enough for game prep, but you're at the point now where it's like, okay, we got to start giving reps to guys that are going to be able to help us on Sunday night against USC in Las Vegas.
Yeah, I think for me, I want to see outside of Ashton Stamps who steps up at corner. Like to
Yeah.
me, that's the one group here where there's just so much up in the air. I think consistently you've seen on the interior D line, it's been Jacoby and Guillory plus Gio Paez / JVR Suggs / Sean Washington. Like all those guys are going to play. Dominic McKinley, I think, is going to play. Cornerback is a little bit different. Like I do think that they're going to have to really kind of neutralize that position a little bit and kind of, go into about 2 or 3 extra or 2 or 3 more guys that can play opposite of Ashton Stamps. And, look, we haven't seen Toviano rep a whole ton with the first team.
Yeah.
We haven't seen Zy Alexander repping with either the first or the second team at this point. I mean, he really looks like he's trying to get back into just physical form before I think they throw him out to the big guys. But we've seen PJ Woodland step up at times. We've seen Jair Brown step up at times. We've seen J.K. Johnson step up at times. Sage Ryan has been pretty consistently with the first team defensive or cornerback outside of Ashton Stamps. So they have bodies. They have guys that can go out there and give you some reps. It's just who can give you the most consistent reps going forward. And, I do think that Ashton Stamps has proven that he can be one of those guys for you. Don't have a great feeling about who else that's going to be on the other side of him and who could be in that kind of nickel role, or when you go to nickel, who can be in that other role. It looks like Major Burns is pretty firmly implanted at the star. It looks like Jordan Gilbert and Jordan Allen / Deshaun Spears are kind of your deep safeties right now. Will be interesting to see if anybody else can throw their hat in the ring there with a guy like Kylan Jackson or one of the or Jawan Johnson maybe if he can. I think Jawan Johnson actually just from a pure coverage standpoint has held up pretty well in the 1-on-1 2-on-2 battles that we've seen so far. But who's going to be that other corner? I think honestly, I'm liking J.K. Johnson. Like I like what I've seen from him. He's long, he hasn't made a ton of plays, but he also hadn't been beaten, just blown by or beaten a ton either. I think he's kind of, really handled himself well here early on in fall camp. But again, it's that consistency deal. Like, who else is going to step up? And even somebody like Stamps has been a little inconsistent as well, but he's the guy that's made the most plays. He's the guy that I think has shown you the most, confidence here, because he's also been going up against Kyron Lacey. He's been going up against Chris Hilton. He's been going up against the guys that have been the best so far. So I think cornerback is probably the position room that I want to see kind of get narrowed down in terms of guys that, I think LSU was going to settle in on. But yeah, what about you? Is there anybody, anything that's kind of sticking out to you on? I mean, I think it's got to be on defense, right? Because I think offensive wise, we have a pretty good understanding of who's going to play, who's going to be out there. But anybody on the defensive ends or tackle? I mean, now that Swinson's back, he slides in, maybe gives Womack something to think about. So I don't know. Is there anybody on that side of the ball you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of play off what you just said right there, I mean, the edge position, Glenn, it feels like there's just a host of guys that could play out there. And they can really get creative. If you're in a third, and let's say you're in a third, and I say third and long to me is third and 8+. Like if you're in a third and 8+ situation, you want a little more athleticism. Maybe you slide a Savion or a Parashand inside to a 3 technique just to get more pass rush capability. And then you can, allow, a guy like Womack to really pin his ears back off the edge and go one-on-one against a tackle. That's something that's going to be interesting, but it's not necessarily for me a question mark. Like it's like you got guys, they've got some really good potential, and you feel like they've got a solid floor in terms of what they can get you. Now, I did want to bring this up because we've not talked about this position room, I feel like, at all. And Blake Baker had made an interesting comment, the linebacker spot. The guy we hadn't talked a lot about is Harold Perkins, because we just figure Harold Perkins is going to be really good. But Baker said, we've got 4 guys that can start at linebacker. He goes, I said we have 4 guys who can start. Now, I think it's going to be interesting. How do you get all those guys on the field? Now, just from what I'm thinking out loud here, Glenn, and you can correct me if you feel differently on this. The 4 guys for me, I feel like would be Perkins, it'd be Penn, and then possibly both Weeks brothers. I mean, outside of that, I think that 4. Outside of that, I think that you've got some developmental guys that could make, some moves, but those are the 4. So, you could really rotate a lot of things. I just think, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, I think Blake Baker's creativity on defense matches well with the personnel you have there. I've got questions about the personnel in general on the defense, but in terms of the linebacker, like that, there might not be a more important group that has to play really well to help offset some potential deficiencies you have on the back end and on that defensive line. Because if you wanted, Perkins, like say at some point you've got to slide Perkins down, which I think they still will, to a pass rusher position. Maybe you insert, one of the Weeks brothers alongside Penn, or Penn comes in, or both Weeks brothers are out there. I just don't feel like there's going to be a massive drop off. I feel like it's a solid position. It's Blake Baker's bread and butter in terms of what he likes to coach. And that's something for me that I think is going to be able to help out. And then just kind of to follow up some comments you talked about on the back end, I thought it was intriguing. And I believe this clip made it into the practice highlights that we posted from yesterday. Corey Raymond was getting on to Ashton Stamps saying, why are you not going against Lacey? I believe Stamps was off to the side. Lacey had gone against one of the other cornerbacks. So it just shows you, I think, whether it's out of necessity or out of that he's proven it, they believe Stamps, and we'll just kind of say it might be cornerback 1 for them. If he's going up, he's got to go up against Lacey and some of those other guys. So, I like what you said. I like what you talked about J.K. Johnson when you talk about a Corey Raymond prototype. Johnson, he checks off every single box. And then just to kind of round it out, you mentioned he's not being talked about a lot. Maybe for LSU fans, Glenn, and we'll kind of end it here. I'll ask you this question. Do you want to go? Of course, we all want to go to a dominant defense if you're an LSU fan, but maybe just not mentioning their names as much this year is maybe a better thing. I mean, how many times we had to talk about it each and every single week last year. Like maybe you're not making a lot of flashy plays, but you're just playing pretty average, pretty well, to where we're not talking about you a lot because you're not making the plays. Maybe that's a positive off of last year that you'd like to have for this year.
Yeah, look, I don't want to get this too twisted here. Like the DBs are still getting beat. Like they're getting beat pretty religiously, and the 1-on-1s and the 2-on-2s in particular. But that's also a drill very much skewed towards the offense. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think you probably take a little bit more from what you see in 7-on-7 and 11-on-11 versus what you see in 1-on-1 drills. But look, I do think that the aggressiveness and the competitiveness of each rep is far better than it was last year. And
Yeah.
so even though they are getting beat, and even though sometimes it's a little more lopsided than other days, it's not because they are just so devoid of technique and talent that they just got no shot against them. Like I do think that
Yeah.
they have an element here to where they've improved, they've developed some, and got a guy like Johnson who, you know, I didn't think looked all that great in the spring. He had very limited reps. He was really off to the side. Even in the spring, didn't have a whole ton of opportunity there with the first, second team. I thought he looked really. I thought he was one of those guys that you came back in the fall thinking, okay, well, where's his spot really?
Yeah.
He's fit in really well, I thought, in the second team mostly, but Jair Brown's fit in really nicely in the second team. I think they've got to play as a unit in the secondary. They've got to be very cohesive. They've got to be communicating well. Communication is going to be a big thing, because I do think that was a part of their problem last year, was a lack of communication. But they're working on those things. I think they've got the right coaches in place to help get them through these next couple weeks, and kind of figure out what they want to do schematically with those defensive backs. But really, the front seven is going to be what this defense is going to have to hang its hat on. They're going to have to get some pressure on the quarterback, going to have to get some pressure in the backfield to really help ease what the defensive backs are doing. So
Yeah.
I think what you talked about there with the linebackers is very fair. How do they mix in all four of those guys? Blake Baker went as far as to say that those guys could all be 4 starters for LSU. Like, so how do you mix in 4 starters for a position group that has 2 guaranteed spots? And one of those spots has got to be Harold Perkins, because you got to have Harold Perkins on the field at all times. So
Yeah.
do you try to devise some different schemes there to where you can get 3 linebackers on the field at once? Do you shift a Whit Weeks over maybe to more of an outside linebacker role, or maybe maybe you have him sub in for Major every once in a while and try to handle some of the star responsibilities? Like, he's athletic enough. I think he's somebody that can roam around and be a good short field area distance coverage kind of guy. But they've got to go exploring there, because I do think that those opportunities are going to be hard to see if you only have 2 inside linebackers. And when you put Harold on the edge, that's when you can kind of move Whit Weeks and West Weeks around and into the mix. But yeah, look, I think if anything, if you guys are taking anything away from this podcast, it's defense is what we're going to be watching for the next 6 days, because there are still a lot of unsettled position groups out there. There's a lot of different combinations that they're still trying, mixing and matching guys at different positions with different players. So it'll be very interesting to see just kind of how they zone in on which 12, 13, 14, 15 kind of players they really feel like are going to be huge parts of this deal week 1 against USC.
Well, Glenn, you may have felt like we didn't say anything, but it's a good reason for people to stay tuned and check out Go 24/7 for the daily practice reports, because it's going to be a ongoing development over, I think, until we get to game week. We'll say of how these guys are going to settle in. But hey, I hope you enjoyed it. Longer podcast, but fall camp is here, folks. We are actually less than 2 weeks from week 0, and 3 weeks from today, LSU is going to be kicking off. I hope Glen's able to make it from the casino to the stadium. We'll have to see if we can keep him in check
Well, if
there
the drinks keep
over in
flowing
Vegas.
on that first night, and when we're sitting down actually, let me rephrase. When I'm sitting down at the blackjack table and losing hundreds and hundreds of dollars, that's when I'll know that it's time to pack it up and get ready for some football. So
there we go. There we go.
I've not had a
Sunday
good
night.
experience. All the 2 times I've gambled, I have not had good experiences. So won't be breaking the bank out in Vegas. That's for sure.
There you go. Just make sure you get outside a little bit, because I've never been to Vegas, but I've obviously heard that once you get inside, they keep it so, I don't know what it is, but you don't even know what time it is in there in those casinos. So we'll take up a fund for Glenn to make sure that he can at least get his flight back home after that game. But obviously, stay tuned. 3 weeks from today, we're going to have great coverage out in Las Vegas with Glen on the ground. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Make sure if you're not already, you're just finding this podcast, you're an LSU fan, click the link down below, sign up for a Go 24/7 membership. Fantastic, great community, recruiting continuing to pop off, fall camp reports, and man, we cannot wait for some college football. But if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like this video, and set up your notifications, and leave a comment, maybe some questions you got on fall camp. We might even answer them next time we're talking on the podcast. And then obviously, if you're listening on any of the platforms, we appreciate you there as well. Make sure you stay tuned and follow. And look, if you're an LSU fan, how can you help us out? Well, if you don't want to do a subscription, just hit follow the podcast. Go on your mom's phone, your dad's phone, whatever you're doing, hit follow the podcast. It helps us in the algorithm there as well. So just, make sure they're okay with it. I guess it doesn't matter. But we'll catch you next time here on the Go 24/7 podcast.